Okay, so here we are back again after our short break, and we're going to continue discussing Jonathan Swift, and we've been talking about A Modest Proposal, and I was just drawing everybody's attention to the proposal as he finally formulates it, how he has been assured by an American. The English, by the way, at this time also looked down on Americans. I mean, even though the Americans in the English colonies were English citizens, they looked down on them. You know, that a young, healthy child well-nursed is at a year old most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, etc., etc. I do therefore humbly offer it to the public consideration that of the 120,000 children already computed, 20,000 may be reserved for breed. Can you believe? Whereof only 1/4 part to be males, which is more than we allow to sheep, black cattle, or swine. Okay? I mean, after all, you don't need a lot of males if all you're talking about is breeding, right? And my reason is that these children are seldom the fruits of marriage, a circumstance not much regarded by our savages. Our savages. See, now the people are regarded as savages. Well, if they're savages, oh, well, in that case, we don't have to give them the same respect and the same rights as we would civilized people. Therefore, one male will be sufficient to serve for females. Serve. See, because all we're talking about is breeding here. That the remaining 100,000 may at a year old be offered in sale to persons of quality and fortune. Persons of quality and fortune throughout the kingdom. Always advising the mothers to let them suck plentifully in the last month, so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish, and seasoned with a little pepper or salt will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter. Well, I mean, we could go on and on and on and on with this, but you certainly get the point. And he elaborates, of course, in talking about how the butchers should be carrying out the butchery and the dressing of the meat. We're talking about human beings, by the way. Now, what's going on here? See the reductio ad absurdum? What he's saying, in effect, is, okay, we English already are treating the Irish in a wholly inhumane way. Now, let's take our inhumane policies to their logical conclusion. Is this not really a form of moral cannibalism, as it were? Okay, if not physical cannibalism, at least a kind of moral cannibalism of these people whom we are exploiting so horribly. Okay, so he is reducing his opponent's argument to a form or position, to a form in which it will be recognized not only as absurd, but as morally untenable. Is morally untenable. And notice how carefully, rhetorically, this has been constructed to lead us and lead us and lead us and lead us along, thinking that we're dealing with a perfectly rational person who's done all of his analysis, computations, gathering of evidence, and so forth, until, of course, then, you know, the trap is sprung. Well, of course, that's when you and I jump back in horror at what is actually being proposed here. So, let's go back to the PowerPoint for a moment. Part of what's going on here is the political agenda that we've been talking about. But part of what's happening also is a demonstration of the limits of scientific rationality. in part, this is a satire on scientific rationality gone mad. Scientific rationality gone mad. That reason must operate within a context of moral values. The moral question for science, and by extension technology, is always going to be, just because we know how to do something, should we do that thing? Just because we know how to do something, should we do that thing? Should we exercise that power? I mean, we have now the scientific knowledge and technology that we could exterminate all life on planet Earth. But I dare say there would not be any sane person who would say that we ought to use that scientific knowledge and technology in order to exterminate all life on planet Earth. Well, what about other things? What about other kinds of things? I mean, it comes up in contemporary discussions about questions like, cloning. You know, what if, I mean, we're very close, right? It's already been done with a sheep. And sheep, by the way, biologically are very close to humans. Okay, so we're not very far from being able to clone whole human beings or parts of human beings. Well, what do we think about that? You see, are there moral considerations here that we should take into account? You see, science is not simply neutral, sealed off in and of itself. Science always has to be subject to moral scrutiny. And I'm not talking about moralism here. I'm talking about asking very serious ethical questions about whether we ought to do something just because we can do it. Okay? We still debate about whether or not we should have dropped those atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Should we or shouldn't we? I mean, there are reasonable people still disagree about that. Because we had the power to do so, should we have exercised that power? Well, I don't have any simple answer to that question, by the way. But what I'm saying is that Swift and others are raising very important questions like that. So my third point, if we can go back briefly to the PowerPoint screen, is that we should have a moral philosophy of science. Not just a philosophy of science, but a moral philosophy of science, including social science. Philosophy of science usually concentrates, I don't know if any of you have taken philosophy of science or not, but philosophy of science usually concentrates on epistemological and methodological questions. That is to say, how do we know what's true and under what conditions can we make certain kinds of truth claims or not make certain kinds of truth claims, or how can we falsify certain kinds of truth claims under what conditions, according to what protocols or rules, and so on and so on and so on. Okay? Very, very, very important questions for the scientist and certainly for the philosopher of science. But notice that in our concern for those questions about knowledge, we don't always give equal attention to the values that are involved. The values that are involved. And that's where, by implication, what Swift is really calling upon us to develop is also an ethical philosophy of science, including social science. Okay, so very interesting and very, very complex thinker and writer. Well, let's go to Gulliver's Travels. And I'm going to have to get back to the beginning here. Gulliver's Travels was done in two different editions, the first one of which was apparently not officially censored, but the printer and company apparently made certain cuts and things that they thought just would not go over with the public. But then Swift was able to oversee the publication of the second edition of Gulliver's Travels in 1735 and was able to restore the things that had been cut from the first edition. So first of all, we know that this is satire. I mean, even if you have not read Gulliver's Travels and know nothing about it until we start talking about it in a moment, you know that it's going to be satire. And it's a satirical use of the genre of the travel narrative. Now, there were lots and lots and lots of travel narratives even before Columbus. Think of the travel narratives of Marco Polo in the Middle Ages. But there were also lots of others. People going to faraway exotic lands, and especially after the opening of the age of exploration in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. There were constantly being published travel narratives. Well, this is a satirical use of that. How? Because Gulliver claims to have gone to different lands where he has met all kinds of foreign peoples who are very, very different from us in important respects. So also, ironically enough, they turn out to be very much like us in certain respects. So we have here the conventional superiority of the Western observer who condescendingly goes into places like Lilliput in the first book or Brobingnag in the second book, and is very condescending towards the people he meets because, after all, he's an enlightened European, right? And he's also a physician. Gulliver claims to be a physician. Okay, and this is also a first-person narrative. Did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. Scott, could we go back to the screen? This is going to be a first-person narrative, and we'll get into that in just a moment, where the book claims not to be by Jonathan Swift. The book claims to be by one Lemuel Gulliver, and that it's his personal travel narrative. We have the use of the foreigner, the other, as we sometimes now say, following especially Edward Said. Remember last segment I mentioned Edward Said and his famous book Orientalism, in which he's talking mainly about the Western treatment of peoples of the Middle East and of the Far East and South Asia and so forth. So the use of the foreigner, the setting up of the foreigner as other from us, other from us, and that becomes a kind of rhetorical device which provides an unusual moral perspective on our own society. So in effect what happens is that Gulliver talks about English society in the different books with the people he is encountering on his travels. And we then get their responses to what are supposed to be the glories of English civilization, which are often very ironic, very ironic. Okay? We have, at the very beginning of the work, something that I haven't asked you to read, but let me just tell you it exists there, that there is this announcement of the publisher to the reader, that this is an absolutely truthful narrative by the narrator, Lemuel Gulliver. And this is part of the apparatus for establishing what seems to be the reliability of the narrative. So it seems to be a completely reliable or truthful narrative. Of course, it's a fiction, but it's constructed as if it were a truthful narrative. Okay? And that question of reliability is going to come up again and again. because the announcement of the publisher to the reader is followed by a letter from Captain Gulliver to his cousin Simpson. So that Gulliver is the putative author. Putative author means simply the one who is pretended to be the author, or who is claimed to be the author. And of course, Gulliver really is a kind of persona adopted by Swift. A mask, a role, like a role in a play. Gulliver is not Swift, just as the modest proposer is not Swift. But Swift can put on a mask and play a rhetorical role for some rhetorical purpose or purposes. And here, Gulliver is the putative author, the one who claims to be the real author, claims to be absolutely reliable, as a truthful person with the highest possible moral integrity. Okay? Let me just briefly summarize the first three books, and then we'll spend some time with Book 4. Part 1 is the Voyage to Lilliput, and I'm not going to be questioning you on the exam about this. So you can either take this down if you wish, or just listen and enjoy at least a paraphrase of Gulliver's Travels. At this point, Gulliver ends up, these are usually through shipwrecks, by the way, but not in the fourth book's case, ends up on this foreign land where the Lilliputians in Lilliput are little people. They're about 12 inches high. And of course, he's full stature. So he is gigantic compared to their smallness. So they're superficially different from Europeans, from Gulliver and other Europeans. But at the same time, they're remarkably similar to us. And their physical smallness becomes a kind of rhetorical figure or device for emphasizing their moral smallness. Their moral smallness. And you have all kinds of amusing details in there in which, of course, here's Gulliver lumbering around, you know, and is always a danger to the people. But they also want to make use of him when they can, though sometimes they're horrifying. Because, for example, when the Queen's chambers catch fire and they call on Gulliver to come in and put out the fire, the only thing that he can think of doing is to urinate on the Queen's chambers. And of course, remember now how much larger he is than the rest of them. So also, you know, in the description of this passage. And of course, they're all horrified by this, especially, you know, because this is the Queen's chamber. You know, what a horrible indecency and indecorousness has been perpetrated here. Well, he eventually gets out of Lilliput and moves along. But then he goes on another voyage and he ends up in another land, the land of Brobingnag. And the Brobingnagians are huge. So there's a reversal in scale. So now they are enormous, and of course he is small in relation to them. And so his small stature is contrasted with the largeness of his hosts. And that makes him very uncomfortable. And he assumes, when he's talking with the king and the king is asking him questions about his, Gulliver's, homeland of England, Gulliver simply assumes a kind of cultural superiority. But then the questioning of the king reveals very rapidly how Western culture is by no means morally superior to the cultures of the rest of the world, even here in the imagined world of the Voyage to Brobingnag. And also, we have other amusing little examples, like the women, when they're together with one another, you know, because here's Gulliver is just this little tiny figure, they behave as if he's not there. And so, you know, sometimes they undress in front of him and so forth. And of course, he's horrified by this. But to them, it's nothing at all, because it's as if, you know, he were a little pet dog or a cat or something like that in the room, rather than a fellow human being. And so part of what Swift does is he weaves various kinds of humorous scenes into these different narratives to emphasize the discomfiture of Gulliver. And then we have in Voyage 3, the voyage to Laputa and so forth. It's kind of a potpourri of a lot of different objects of satire. And there's particularly a satire on unworldly intellectuals. Unworldly intellectuals. I mean, after all, there's nothing wrong with having intellectuals in a culture if what we're talking about are people of learning and education and, you know, people who use their heads to try to figure out problems and so forth. But we often make an object of fun unworldly intellectuals, you know, people whose heads are just off in the clouds. And then, of course, there's satire on conventional thinking, such as in the case of the Struldbrugs, who are figures, and this is something that comes up in classical mythology, comes up again in the 19th century in certain interesting poetry that we may look at next semester, who, yes, they grow older, but they don't die. And sometimes we think, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we didn't die? Well, yeah, it would be wonderful if we didn't die, I suppose, if at the same time we could conquer aging. I mean, do you really want to live forever if you just get older and older and older and older and older? Okay, without ever any kind of release from that, and you become weaker and more infirm and subject to all of the kinds of difficulties and diseases of people in extreme old age? Well, you know, obviously, most of us, if faced with the choice in those terms, would say, well, no, no thank you. Okay, so this is just another one of the things that Swift, in the person of Gulliver now, or through the persona of Gulliver, is casting his satirical barbs at. And then we get to the fourth voyage. He now is not the surgeon. Remember, he's a physician. He's not now the surgeon on the ship, but he's the captain of the ship. A number of his men die as a result of disease, so he has to pick up some other guys and comes to find out that they're a bad lot. And so they mutiny against him, and he is put off the ship and ends up in the land of the Houyhnhnms, the Houyhnhnms. And so we have the whole question of misanthropy. That is to say, misanthropy is a word that, does anybody know here what the word misanthropy means? Nobody knows what misanthropy means?
Dislike of mankind.
Exactly, very good. Dislike of mankind. Attack on mankind in general, or humankind in general. Okay, that would be misanthropy. Okay. Now, what Swift actually does in a letter to his friend Alexander Pope is he says that he has redefined his notion of human nature. The classical definition of human nature is that humans are rational animals. Rational animals. That we are both reason and animality in the sense of our physical nature, right? That's why we are in the middling state in the great chain of being. But according to Swift, he has decided that human nature should be defined as animal rationis capax. And what that means is that the human being is an animal capax, capable rationis, of reason or rationality. An animal capable of reason or rationality. Now that's different, isn't it, than saying that humans are rational animals. Swift is now saying humans are animals who are capable of reason or rationality, but often enough don't exercise it. And then, of course, we have the rhetorical notion of the noble savage. We've talked about that here before. The 18th century concept, though it really begins a little earlier than the 18th century, but it comes to be more and more and more a prominent idea in the 18th century until finally it becomes virtually a cliche with the French philosopher and writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So the noble savage is the person who lives out there in a state of nature, but who is more truly noble than we are. Okay? So the person whom we might initially and superficially think to be inferior, culturally inferior, because living in primitive and uncivilized circumstances, turns out, ironically and paradoxically, to be superior to us. Superior to us. Okay. So the story begins with treachery, the mutiny of Gulliver's crew. And when he has his first contact with the Yahoos, he is repulsed by them. And part of what repulses him is that the Yahoos resemble him and other human beings. Now, it's true that their bodies tend to be covered with hair, and his is not covered with hair. But nonetheless, he recognizes that they are all too human, and they are filthy, disgusting, animal-like beings. Okay? And his recognizing a kind of affinity with them throws him into a kind of revulsion. Okay? Whereas the Houyhnhnms, notice that the very word Houyhnhnm would probably have to be pronounced something like Houyhnhnm, Houyhnhnm. And that sounds like what? Sounds like a horse. Right, sounds like a horse. Because the Houyhnhnms are the only truly rational animals in this ironic work. Here are horses. Certainly we regard the horse as a noble creature in our culture, but we don't think of the horse as rational. But here the horses are speaking with one another. They develop a perfectly well-ordered society with perfectly reasonable laws and cultural values, in contrast to that of human beings who turn out to be really quite irrational from the point of view of the Houyhnhnms. And gradually, Gulliver is not only recognized by the Houyhnhnms as a better than average Yahoo, but he comes to recognize himself as an only slightly better than average Yahoo. And so he undergoes a kind of education among the Houyhnhnms, once he's learned the horse language, by the way, the whinnying language. And so he's able to converse with them and they with him. And he undergoes a complete conversion. And finally, Gulliver is sent away by the Houyhnhnms. He's rescued in the sea by a certain Captain Pedro de Mendez, who's the captain of the ship. And Pedro de Mendez turns out to be actually an ideal human being. He's a very decent, humane, and reasonable person. The Yahoos, of course, would represent human beings as their most degraded, their most degenerated, their most barbaric. The Houyhnhnms are rational animals, but they are so rational that they have no reason for any kind, or no room for any kind of emotion, for any kind of real feeling. Whereas Pedro de Mendez is not only a very reasonable person, but he is also a very compassionate and deeply feeling person. And so he appears to represent a kind of ideal of what human beings at their best should be capable of. On the other hand, Gulliver doesn't recognize that. I mean, Swift is expecting us to recognize that. But Gulliver doesn't recognize it. So then, when Gulliver returns home to England, he is absolutely repulsed by his wife and children, whom he regards really as little better than Yahoos. And so he prefers the company of his horses, and he goes out to the stable and converses with his horses. Well, of course, once you get that image in your mind, you realize this guy's totally gone mad. Well, what does that tell us about the reliability of Lemuel Gulliver as a guide, and especially as a kind of, philosophical or ethical guide in the travels, and as a commentator on Western society, particularly that of England? I mean, here's a guy who's gone totally bonkers. Well, at the same time, if we think about it, the guy whom we meet conversing with his horses in the stable is the same guy who began the work way back when in writing books 1, 2, and 3, as well as 4. So how reliable has he been all along? I mean, that's an interesting question, by the way. It's not unlike the question, if I may take a 20th century work that many of you will be familiar with, Catcher in the Rye. Remember, you go through the entire story, and Holden Caulfield is telling the whole story, and it's only at the end of the work that we discover that he's in a mental institution. And so everything now is twisted around, ironically. How reliable is his narrative? I mean, after all, we have been listening to the narrative of somebody who is very seriously disturbed. So also with Gulliver, if we go back a couple of centuries earlier. So, some interesting kinds of questions. So questions for interpretation also have to do with how seriously are we to take the rule of reason among the Houyhnhnms? Is that to be taken seriously or not? Does his madness, his mad misanthropy at the end, undercut the value of what he has learned along the way? Notice that Swift has rendered that ambiguous. Ambiguous in the sense that there's no clear way of deciding one way or the other. There's no clear way of deciding one way or the other. Okay? The question of what is the function of Pedro de Mendes? Well, I've already been talking about that. Pedro de Mendes seems to be a representative of a kind of decent, compassionate humanity capable of genuine feeling, while at the same time, Pedro de Mendes is a very reasonable person. So he's neither the extreme of the Yahoo nor the extreme of the Houyhnhnm. And then, of course, I simply restate the point that I was making earlier. Since the Gulliver we see at the end of Part 4 is the author of the entire work, beginning with Part 1, how reliable has he been all along? And again, that's an interesting question, and a question to which there's no simple answer. Okay? You don't have to get down all my exact words here just to get the basic sense of the questions that I'm raising here. Okay? And then we would come to a modest proposal. Okay, so one of the things that Swift does, and if we can go to the tablet, I want to write this word on here, is he uses a device which the Russian formalists, who are some critics, literary critics and cultural critics, right around World War I and then right after World War I, mainly in Russia, though after the Russian Revolution, some stayed and some migrated to the West. And that's called defamiliarizing. Or you can put this in the form of a noun, defamiliarization. Okay, defamiliarizing or defamiliarization. Now, what that means is the concept that was developed by the Russian formalists in the early part of the 20th century. What that means is that sometimes things become so familiar to us that we can't really see them for what they are. So sometimes what we have to do is take our reality and distort it in such a way that it no longer is so familiar to us that we accept it and take it for granted. Okay? Sometimes we come to accept things so much as they are because they're so familiar to us that we simply assume, well, that's the way things are, that's the way they're supposed to be. They've always been that way. They always should be that way. That there can be a device, a literary and rhetorical device, which they coined the term defamiliarizing or defamiliarization for, where you take something familiar and you distort it in such a way that the familiar reality now is seen in a totally new light, from a totally new perspective. Okay? Now, look at the modest proposal. What do we have? Presumably, many of the people who are walking around the streets of Dublin were simply taking for granted, well, that's the way things are. I mean, it's too bad that we have poor people around. It's too bad that they've got these children in rags. Yeah, all of that's too bad, but, you know, that's the way of the world. What are you going to do about it? Okay? So what Swift does in A Modest Proposal is he develops a rhetorical strategy to take the familiar social landscape and suddenly, by a kind of change of perspective, by a kind of distorting of perspective, he renders it in such a way that we see it for the first time for what it really is. He defamiliarizes it so that we can see it for what it really is. If the way in which we English have been behaving towards the Irish really all along has been inhumane, this becomes a way of exposing the inhumanity with which we have become all too familiar. Okay? See how the technique of defamiliarizing can work? Look at Pope's Rape of the Lock. Look at the description of Belinda as a goddess worshiping before a shrine. And then we realize, of course, that this is Belinda at her vanity putting on her makeup with the help of her maid. Well, that is a kind of defamiliarizing of the everyday occurrence of somebody putting on makeup, right? So we now see it in a totally different way than we might have otherwise. So also here. We see in descriptions of the Yahoos are animal-like, and yet they're also human-like. And there's even one point at which there is a female Yahoo who, when Gulliver is in the water and he's bathing, this female Yahoo jumps in and tries to force herself sexually on him. And of course he's horrified. He's horrified, not simply by the sexual advance, but also by the fact that she's a Yahoo, as if she thinks that she is of the same kind as he. Okay? And this becomes, notice, in his coming awareness that he is really and only slightly better than average Yahoo. This becomes a way of defamiliarizing certain aspects of human nature, according to Swift. That all along we are in certain respects Yahoo-like, according to Swift. Or at least many of us are Yahoo-like. You ever heard that expression, by the way? Sometimes you hear that from older people who will yell out, "Look at that Yahoo." Well, that's where the expression comes from. It comes from Jonathan Swift. So my point here is that strategy becomes a way of defamiliarizing. Well, then we look at the Houyhnhnms. Well, what if you take to a kind of absurd extreme the notion that we should really be rational animals and prize rationality to such an extent that we become nothing but rational? We become nothing but rational? Well, then you have something like a Houyhnhnm. But the Houyhnhnm, the very image of the horse, which is the reasonable animal, becomes a way of defamiliarizing the whole concept of humans as rational animals. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Any lack of clarity about that? So that the Houyhnhnms become a kind of satire on the more optimistic kinds of philosophers and deists who think that human nature is infinitely perfectible. Infinitely perfectible, if only we could become pure reason. Then we would have achieved our full potential as rational animals. Yeah, but reasonableness, rationality, good qualities as these are, wonderful qualities as these are, and look at all the wonderful things that we've accomplished through the exercise of reason. at the same time, do we want really to be nothing but pure reason? There are certain admirable things about the Houyhnhnms and about their kind of society, but ultimately it's without any kind of passion, without any kind of emotion, without even any kind of real compassion. So it is not horrible in the same way that the Yahoo culture is, but it too is a kind of defamiliarizing of philosophical currents that were developing in the 18th century, which emphasized reason and rationality to such an extent that the claim was often being made by these philosophical optimists and deists that human beings were infinitely perfectible, but only to the extent to which they became more and more and more pure reason. Okay? Okay. What we're going to be doing, and maybe we can do a little bit of this here now, but we're certainly going to do this at the beginning of our next class, is actually looking at a few passages in which we actually see the horror, as in chapter 2, the horror and astonishment not to be described when I observed in this abominable animal a perfect human figure. The face of it indeed was flat and broad. This is in chapter 2, paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4. Paragraph 4 of chapter 2. Okay? My horror and astonishment are not to be described when I observed in this abominable animal a perfect human figure. The face of it indeed was flat and broad. Okay, this is a defamiliarizing of one side of human nature so that we can see some of its tendencies in this defamiliarized form. Things that we might not otherwise recognize when they become all too familiar to us. Okay? So, we're going to be going on with various other illustrations of that. We're almost out of time in this particular class, but I'll give you some more illustrations of that in our next segment. And also, you can be looking in Book 4 or Part 4 of Gulliver's Travels for examples of your own, descriptions in particular of the Yahoos and of the Houyhnhnms, and of Gulliver's responses to the Yahoos and the Houyhnhnms. And bear in mind something that I've been talking about all along. That is to say, the rhetorical strategy of not only reducing things to absurdity, and obviously Part 4 of Gulliver's Travels reduces those two views of human nature to a kind of absurdity, but also the use of the rhetorical strategy of the persona. Gulliver is not Swift, but Swift, for the time being at any rate, can adopt the mask like an ancient actor and speak with the voice of Gulliver for, in this case, comic and ironic and satirical purposes. So, we'll pick up with this at the beginning of next segment.